So I'd like to welcome my friend Lewis Gordon to the podcast today. Today's topic is we're going to talk about the importance of this philosophical concept from Jean-Paul Sartre that's existence precedes essence. And what people don't really think about is that much of Western European thought had essence preceding existence. And essence, in a very simple way, is just your ideas, your identity, things that define you that kind of exist within your brain and not what exists in the world around you. And this can be quite detrimental if your essence is more important to you than your existence. And Europeans kind of concluded, or at least some of them did, that was quite problematic. And so as people, especially African Americans and people around the world, are trying to make sure that our lives are as enriched and nourishing and helpful as possible, making sure that existence precedes essence is really important. And this is like a profound philosophical idea, but it's something that's quite applicable. And Lewis is an acclaimed philosopher that focuses on existentialism, and so his expertise is going to be quite helpful. And his book, Fear of Black Consciousness, really talks about this to such a profound and impactful degree. So I'm really, really happy to have Lewis on the show today. Thanks, Lewis.
Thanks, Barrett. I'm happy to be here.
So my first question for you is, in Fear of Black Consciousness, you talk a lot right at the beginning, which I think is really, really important, about breath within the Black discourse, especially the Black Lives Matter movement and, I can't breathe. And I think in America, we have this conversation, it's quite emotive. And we don't have a philosophical conversation about breath and how that connects to existence. And I think you touch upon this. And so could you elaborate on how the language we use has a philosophical connection that we may not be aware of, and how this influences your work and your life as an African American in the US?
Totally. Well, the first thing is, it's interesting you brought up language, because we've inherited a very distorted view of language. It's in the same way we've inherited distorted views of technology, distorted views of the physical world. And that is, we imagine ourselves as separate, and that we put them on the way we put on our clothes. You could put on language the way you could put on a jacket and so forth. But it's a complete distortion of what we're about. Okay, so I'll start with what you just said about breath. And this is really crucial, because the specific context you're talking about is the emergence of African Americans and the whole situation of the Middle Passage, the whole situation of also pre-colonial Africa, etc. And one of the things we don't often realize is that, first of all, we already know this part. Humanity evolved in Africa. That we know. But the other thing that many of us fail to understand is that we are basically a mixture of a bunch of hominins that preceded us. Hominins have been around for more than 1 million years. But our version, have been around 300 to 400,000 years. And for that 1 million years, a lot of other hominins weren't wasting their time. They were busy building and doing all kinds of other things. So by the time we came on the scene, there was already a lot happening. There were already, for instance, fire, tools, all kinds of things. And within that framework, that means that we entered a world in which we were not actually separated from our environment, but we were integrated in it in a very profound way. And what a lot of ancient African folks thought about in their language, for instance, the language of Meduneter, is the intimate connection between water, breathing, and life. And so even when in ancient languages, such as Meduneter, one talks about existence, you don't exist the way in colonial or inherited European forms you think of being. And in fact, even in ancient Europe, people didn't think about it as being. That was imposed upon them. To exist is to exist as what? To be doing what? What are you doing when you exist? And this activity, this active, dynamic view of existing, that is also linked to life. And, some of it has been retained in the French language because existence means both to stand out and to live. So we begin with this insight that breathing is one of these wonderful and at the same time mysterious activities. In the cold, you can see the breath. But ordinarily, as you're going around, there's this invisible thing going on that's maintaining life. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, grave robbers in ancient Africa, they would break off the nose of the monuments that were standing over to protect the dead. Because the argument is if you can stop them from breathing, then they're really dead and they cannot follow you. So you could see the link there. But of course, let's face it, when you think of something as horrible as, packing people into the hulls of ships and dragging them across with hardly any air, they're experiencing the process of dying. And when we think about what colonialism was about, the fact that it is marked by lynching, asphyxiation, then we already see allegorically and metaphorically the significance of disempowerment, of dehumanization, of colonization as asphyxiation. So breath, life, acting, existence, they're connected.
It's just, you took it all the way back to before human beings existed to talk about breath. And so that's why one of the many reasons I'm happy for you to be the guest on the show.
Well, yes, there's a little thing I could just add before you go to the next point, which is the flipping. And what I say by the flipping, if you look at, for instance, a lot of ancient East African myths, the soil was masculine, was male. The sky, air, was female, and water was also linked to female. But among the Greeks and the Romans, they turned it upside down because their logic was, yo, the woman shouldn't be on top. So, so they changed it and changed the name. So Nut, which represented was female, above, in ancient Kemet or East African thought, and Geb, which was below, was male, and she mounted him to produce the gods. They weren't having this, so they slightly changed the name, and Nut became Ut and Uranos, and Geb became Gaia. So today we think of Mother Earth, but it was Father Earth and Mother Sky. And what's interesting about this, of course, when we do think of where our life begins, we don't really think of our life really beginning with our dad's sperm. We think of our life in the amniotic fluid, in our mother hearing her heartbeat, all of that stuff. So this is something really crucial because, it's a technical thing, but I know you love analyzing language, but the Greek term for substance, for being and things is ousia, from which you get terms like ontic and ontos, etc. And so you could see how this kind of masculine patriarchal view tries to look at fixing reality in the male rather than dealing with the fluidity of what it is to live. And so part of the African understanding, a lot of those Africans who were coming over, they were actually linked into that other understanding of earth in terms of male and sky in terms of female, and you notice in this the fact that water mirrors the sky. So that means that the male is actually dealing with two dimensions of femininity. But anyway, that's a whole other thing, but you gave me an opportunity to give a reflection.
Oh, that's a perfect tangent, because one of the things that I'm thinking for my next book is when you're talking about language and that language taking shape and being something that actively empowers people to engage in something. Because if you live in an ethnocidal society, which I talk about in my book, your language is going to be disingenuous, because if you honestly articulate what your agenda is to destroy another person's culture, there's a greater likelihood that people won't want to engage with you. So there's a desire to make sure that your language is disingenuous, deceptive, hollow. And so now there's a need to articulate language that is in good faith and not bad faith, that gets people to act. And throughout history, that language has been myths. Myths have been narratives that have been encouraging people to act in a particular way so that they can evolve and grow and understand the world around them. And so many of the myths, I think, that derive in Europe, and especially like biblical myths, when you really examine them, I'm like, that's backwards. Like the idea that the woman came from the man's rib is a complete inversion of reality, because we all know we come from women. Like that's just, we all know that. So the idea that you have a mythology that just so blatantly is inverting existence is just astonishing to me. And you just think of like how that without people thinking about it, has probably just corrupted a lot of people's minds, where they're viewing life backwards.
Sure. And in fact, the thing that I talk about right away in Fear of Black Consciousness, and one of the things I love that you do with Crime Without a Name is basically, we point out that disempowerment, oppression, dehumanization are all based on lies. They're just lies. Because think about it. I mean, to dehumanize a person, you have to find a human being and then say you're not a human being. Yeah. That's a lie. But 100%. But the thing about it is they're deeper lies. So, for instance, the point you just made about myth. All myth is ultimately, in its origins, it means from the mouth, muthos. So that opening point you made about breath, we breathe through our nose and our mouth. And the thing about something being told from the mouth is that it's repeated. So the mistake that many people make about myth is they think myth is about what's true or false. No, the myth is about meaning. And why this is crucial is because human beings cannot live without meaning. Think about it. If our life loses meaning, many of us, it's over. We walk off a cliff. But the thing about myth is that all myth, because it's repeated, has a myth beneath the myth. And as we begin to understand this dynamic element of myth, we begin to understand also certain other things that happen when we try to suppress myth. So, for instance, some people would try to suppress the mouth, close the mouth, by focusing on the eyes. But eyes, although it interacts with the environment, they don't breathe. And so ultimately, but here's the thing, you can see, but if you see without meaning, then you might as well not be seeing at all. It'd be unintelligible. So here's the error that's made about language. Many people mistakenly think we have language. It's just like many people think we have technology, the way I could hold up a cup. But what they don't realize is that we are actually the manifestation of language. And so to create a form of distorted view of language, in other words, the thingification, turning it into a frozen thing, would be the dehumanization of language. And if you dehumanize language, you take it out of its communicative framework. In other words, it doesn't reach for others. And if you no longer reach for others, you're only turned inward and you implode. All forms of oppression lead to implosion. So at the heart of what we are communicating realities. And the thing about it is that communicating realities are always open because there's always something more to communicate. And that is the implicit meaning of freedom and existence.
So this is a perfect segue of where I wanted to go with this, because when you think of language, human beings, what differentiates us from other animals on the planet is the capacity for complex language, where like our humanity comes from the complexity and the continuation of our language. That's a key distinction between us and other animals. Not that they don't communicate, clearly they do, but we just have a capacity that exceeds what other animals are capable of doing. So our humanity is our language. And by delegitimizing language or dehumanizing language, we're actually destroying our own humanity. And in my book, The Crime Without a Name, I just organically started using more and more Germanic language, like, from using German, and I made the word Geistmord.
Ja,
And
das gefällt mir sehr gut.
see, so this is actually this.
I just said I dig it.
See, this is the part that's really fascinating because this morning at breakfast I met a German person for the first time, and so next thing we're just talking about my work and German words, and at the end he was like, do you speak German? I was like, I don't speak German. He's like, you should study German, like you have for your work, German would be super beneficial. And I told him that, and this is I thought about this because I have a fascination with language, but I'm actually not that great at communicating in other languages. And the reason is when you think in another language, when you speak another language, you think it become like a different version of yourself to a certain extent, And
yeah, but that's great. Actually, that's what I love about it.
See, I think it's a great thing too. But as a kid growing up in the South, and you can tell from my book, I just thought the world around me was just crazy. The thing that kept me sane was like my mind, like being myself is what like kept a sanity. And when I would learn another language and I would get to that point where my brain would click over and I would start thinking as another person, my body just like responded instinctively like, this is weird. I don't like this because I was just, the world around me was nuts and my mind is what helped me be like stable. I'm like, now I'm old enough and mature enough and I've I have a better wherewithal of the world. And I think I'm a bit better at language now than I was as a kid, but it's a fascinating thing where like, that's why there's an impediment because I didn't feel comfortable thinking as another person because anyways.
Yeah, but it's not another person. What it is it's another dimension of you.
Exactly. And
that's all.
And that's where like with maturity, you get like that additional level of clarity and you can overcome like the fears or the discomfort you might have had as a child as you're learning stuff within a ethnocidal place. But the thing that I think is to talk about breath and language, you talk about, breath in the book, but you also talk about not the importance, but just how we're Black people, there's a desire or a proclivity to just talk about Black bodies. And by talking about Black bodies, it's like almost a dehumanizing discourse towards yourself. And this is linguistically problematic. And I think it speaks to one of our favorite words I've said a bunch on this podcast already, Geistmord, where when you live in an ethnocidal place that exists to destroy the soul, spirit, mind of people, then there becomes like whether a conscious or a subconscious discourse where there's an absence of breath, but also you refer to like your own body as if there isn't breath in it either. And I found that to be just very profound in how the subtleties of this like linguistic psychological corruption that occurs. And so
sure. I mean, Fanon said it beautifully, which is he called it the epidermal schema, which is what happens when you're looked at as pure externality. But in everyday language, so many people are talking about Black bodies that they're forgetting Black people. And, and what it is, and one of the things, earlier when you spoke about language, you see the thing about there's a distinction between signification or signs, right? Where signs are basically when you point to something and there is a one-to-one relationship with it. And many people, because of thinking through signs, confuse language with translation. So what they think is, for instance, when we bring up different languages, they think that it's just a matter of mapping on one language to another, and that's a big mistake. What actually goes on is that what produces, because we are living language, we don't always live exactly the same thing, and especially at the same time. And so what we may develop could be such that when we encounter people who speak different languages, that's a lot of what we share initially we can map on. But there's a point at which there is the untranslatable, which you write about with Pandaren in your discussion of Dutch. And the thing that many people miss, and this is the crucial part, when you learn a language, you're not translating. What you have to do when you encounter words you can't even translate, you learn them. You just use them and you learn them. And after a while, and in fact, and it's not just with what we could call spoken languages. This happens with mathematics. There are people who thematize reality in 18, 20, 30 dimensions. Now, it's very hard for us to think in that way, but the people who do that, after a while, they're communicating with each other, and they are actually in conversation about different dimensions. It's just that what many people say, well, tell us what it's like. What they're really saying is put it into our 3 and 4 dimensions, which is a contradiction. Well, similarly, in the animal world, there's a complexity in terms of what they will work through, whether it's smells, whether it's the range of ultraviolet light and stuff like that. But the thing what you have to understand is and there's a philosopher by the name of Eva Kate, where she talks about this in a book called What I Learned from My Daughter. And what that is what we need to understand is that the language we speak, it's not language itself, the language we speak. And when I say we, I mean Homo sapiens, okay, is the language that discloses the world we live in, human reality. So when we hinder something that every human being shares, then what we're doing is trying to push some human beings outside of the human world. And that's why it occasions oppression and suffering. Because ultimately, we can actually only live in a human world. You take us out of it, and basically, it's, as you said, Geistmord, right?
Yeah.
Right? Spirit death.
Pretty much.
Okay?
No, that's a perfect way to articulate it. And it's fascinating where if you live in an ethnocidal society, a place that's normalized a language and a way of life that consists of othering people and destroying their culture, whether that's their physical culture, but also their spiritual culture and their mind and their intelligence, we create this dehumanizing language that suppresses all of our humanity. And we then have to come up with new language to transcend that. And if we don't, we will then accidentally refer to ourselves and refer to other people in dehumanizing ways and just not be aware of it, because that's the only way we know how to describe things. And it's really troubling because as African Americans, there's clearly a desire within our culture to create that liberating discourse. But we're in a society where that discourse has been dehumanizing and oppressive, and then we trip up and refer to Black people as Black bodies, or we talk about Black breath, and we don't see that breath is actually like a philosophical conversation. It's a discourse about the beginnings of us on the transatlantic slave trade and the oppression, but also like breathing as a proactive activity that can enrich your humanity. And we can like use that breath to empower ourselves and not it be like a conversation about the erasure and denial of breath. It can be something about the enriching of breath to empower our community. So there's so many like linguistic impediments that become psychological impediments that we try to surmount, stumble, and the discourse has to get elevated to embrace all of our humanity.
Well, one of the things when you brought up the other before, one of the creative insights, not only from Fanon, but it's something Frantz Fanon, but also, and he was a physician, so I mean, this is something he thought about quite a bit. In fact, he talks about breath all over the place in all of his books and his articles. But one of the things he noticed is that what racism does is to create a very strange lie, and it is this: there are selves, there are others, and then there are those who are not selves and not others. And that is the thing. You see, the human world has others. Like this sentence makes no sense. Here I am, and here's another cup. Makes no sense.
No.
I have to say, here I am, and here's another human being. Now, as long as there's an other, you have ethical life. However, if you push people outside of the relationship of even being others, then, if I smash the cup, people would just say, well, why you mess up a piece of property or something like that? But they're not going to, you know what I mean? It's not going to take on a different moral valence.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you go and slam a human being's head into a wall, you are actually now violating an other. Now, shows why it's so scary, because to convince a group of people that another group of people are not even others means you can do almost anything you would like to them with impunity. And we already know about the history of that violence. But at the same time, the story, particularly of the people who became black, I talk about the lowercase black, was never a story of sitting down passively. And that understanding that there is a world whose project is trying to close us off, to make us into things, we begin to realize, wait a minute, why should I live by that standard? Why don't I ask myself the question of there being something wrong with any society or social system that tries to turn me into a thing? And at that moment, the moment you realize you're not a thing, you begin to have this phenomenon called potential. And I call it, Jane Gordon actually calls it potentiated double consciousness. And it's from Du Bois, but potentiated double consciousness is that reassertion of life even in the midst of what could be despair. This is the existential part. African Americans, the reason there has to be this constant lie to us and to people in the African continent and all through the global South is because we never took it sitting down. We went throughout building creatively life. Life not only in the forms of music, life not only in the forms of inventions, life not only in the forms of foods, but life also in the form of love, radical love. We're able to bring this infusion of breathing, as you're mentioning it, into a public sphere of joy. And this is something some people could never understand. If you go and read a lot of not only racist literature, anti-Black racist literature, but even people who may seem pretty cool, a kind of like more progressive European literature, read closely. A lot of them say, right, they just can't understand Black people. And the reason they can't is because they cannot imagine being Black and actually having a sense of dignity and an assertion of freedom. But they don't understand that ultimately part of being Black is this understanding that it's a lie to create a category of people who are supposedly above people. Those are the superiors. That's just BS, because that means you got to pretend you're a god. But there's also a lie of trying to push people below being human, because ultimately what's lost if there are those above and those below? Where is the human being? So ultimately, this question, the world that we could actually live in, a lot of Blackness historically has been a struggle for the actual liberation of humanity. There are people who don't understand when they try to retort when you say Black Lives Matter, that all lives matter. Shoots. If all lives were really mattering, then there wouldn't have been such exclusion of us. The issue is to remind people that you can't say democracy, you can't say freedom when you're systematically blocking a group of people from participation and being able to come out in the open with dignity. So Black Lives Matter as a struggle for democracy is a struggle for freedom, and it's a struggle for life. And they're interconnected. And these are situations we have seen from our ancestors who got up, and despite all the absurdity, despite all that was being said, to push us to say we have no future, nowhere to go, nothing. You and I know that those people did something. And the reason we know is because you and I are able to have a conversation right now.
100%. And I will say, like, when you were talking about, just the structure of racism and, people imagining that they're gods and making people subhuman, it reminded me of, like, when I was a kid, and I mentioned this in the book, that when racism hit me, like, I realized it was a thing in elementary school, it just didn't make any sense to me. And I processed that these white people were judging me based on something I have nothing to do with. Not saying that being black was good or bad, but I didn't pick my parents. So if you can say that I'm bad due to something that has nothing to do with any of my actions or whatever, then you're capable of just arbitrarily saying I'm good or bad at any day of the week, at any time, no matter what I ever do. And at that point, I was just like, this is crazy. These people are crazy. And I can't spend any time trying to do anything to get them to like me, because it doesn't matter. They don't have to have their
It's a waste of time. It's a waste of time.
Like if people do like me, that's great. But I don't need to perceive myself or modify myself or cater to trying to get some sort of approval from a group of people that don't have to have their opinions based on existence. It can just be based off of like delusions and false ideas. That's ridiculous. And the thing that was fascinating is when you're a kid, you don't have the language to really articulate that complex thought. It's just kind of like an emotion, and you say like, that's dumb, or this, I don't like that, or whatever. As you get older, you get the layers to articulate all of that. And my book in many ways is that endeavor where it's a cultural problem and not a racial problem, because the racial structures derive from this cultural flaw, which is, as I say, ethnocide, but that's clearly the division of people and the destruction of human life by breaking people and not having the human middle or, common square. And I'm thinking about this because, and you touched upon it in, what you just said, but in your book, you talk about Black consciousness with a lowercase b, but Black consciousness with a capital B. And could you just elaborate on that distinction? Because I think that's quite significant, because I also think this is indicative of like the linguistic progression that the Black community works to make, because the words that have been used to define us and to give the identity that's been thrust upon it, this language doesn't derive from us. And so liberation in many ways for us is the cultivation of a language that transcends the one that has been forced upon us for centuries.
Well, sure. I mean, look, if you're just going to use physical violence to dominate a people or control a people, you'll run out of your resources very quickly. You got to convince the people that they deserve to be dominated, and then they'll do all the work for you. So that's the lowercase b, Black consciousness.
So
right?
so bleak. That's the and it's lowercase b because that's kind of like why is it lowercase?
Yeah, well, it's lowercase mainly because it was already constructed in the diminutive. And the other reason about it, it's very interesting, even though Black was progress, because the term Negro was just from Spanish and Portuguese to say Black, but for the French and for the people who speak English, there's where it gets tricky, because French does have a word for Black. It's called la noir, and la noir. Black. It's interesting that the French introduced a term called le nègre, and le nègre was an effort to, in its construction, create a distance to say this is a new kind of being, a kind of thing. And it's rather striking because in English we do have a word for Black. It's called black, but as you know, the initial discourse went to Negro again to create a distance, to create a way of being pejorative. And in fact, the pejorative N word comes from the Scottish pronunciation of the French word le nègre. Now, the thing is rather striking. There are two things. The first thing to bear in mind is that the absurdity of trying to say that one is intrinsically superior connects to your initial point. That's where you're going to put essence before existence. So that's the lie. There's a need to say you had to be. Though every human being has to deal with an awful truth, which is the universe or the multiverse was fine without us. And one day it'll be without us again, and it'll be just fine. So part of our hubris, our narcissism, our species is narcissistic, but there's good narcissism and bad narcissism. Good narcissism is when we talked about language. If you think about what being a human being is, we spend a lot of time looking at and talking about human beings. That's pretty much what it is, right? We live in a human world. That's a healthy narcissism because we're looking outward at one another. Bad narcissism is when you're turning away from the outside and turning inward to imagine you're intrinsically, essentially, etc., superior or better. And that gives you this delusion that you have a right to everything, every single thing. And that requires an obsession with control. So one of the things that's really funny is if we start with lowercase black, it's amazing when you look at anti-black racism and you look at discourses of white supremacy. A lot of white folks spend a lot of time telling us they hate us or don't like us or not attracted to us and so forth. And I usually put it in the context of gender. If a dude walks up to a woman and is constantly telling her he's not into her, he's into her, right?
Yeah.
And so all of it, yeah, this is one of the things I love about the movie Get Out, in that it brings that point out. There's desire there. So first of all, despite all the BS they say out there, the ultimate fear of racists is their eventual irrelevance. That's the real fear. And they remain relevant when systems of power, institutions of power, are linked to help them in the lies about their relevance. Now, uppercase B black, that's when we begin to realize the political task of making a better world, that we're agents of history, there are things we can do, and that ultimately we don't have to hate other people. What we need to understand is what we need to work with humanity, all of humanity, to build. And sure, there's some people who won't be on the bandwagon, but if they become irrelevant in the sense that power doesn't depend on them anymore, they can hate me all they like. They're inconsequential. So what we ultimately, the struggle for liberation is about, is to make malfeasant or malevolent or negative attachments, which are ultimately insecure and small, irrelevant, by understanding what it is to build a world of a larger picture. Hate is always easy. Hate is really easy. It's really easy to burn down a house, but it takes a community to build one. Love is harder, and that's the thing we have to work on.
And that's just a perfect way to articulate that, because that's why I think philosophy is so important, because when you really break it down, especially if you take it like outside of like the Western perspective, but philosophy gives you the capacity to consistently engage in particular actions. So if you have a proactive philosophy of doing good things, and in my book, I use the phrase Evtopia as a good place, then you can consistently do it because it's so much easier to do something destructive. But therefore, if you have an aspiration to do something good, you need a philosophy so that you have a greater likelihood to consistently engage in that action. Because if you don't consistently do it, it won't come to fruition. And that's where the philosophy, and that's also where myth come together to help people consistently engage in something. And that's why you need to have, constructive and not destructive myths, because if you have a destructive one, you'll go colonize the world and ruin a whole bunch of people's lives.
Sure. And you also dehumanize yourself, because remember, that superior is not human. That's actually, when you make yourself above humanity, you're no longer human.
I just want to chime in, because this is so funny how much of this comes into play with this conversation I had with this German person I just met today at breakfast, where I told him as a kid, because I was like good at stuff as a kid, like I'd make decent grades and I was pretty good at sports, and there was definitely a desire that people expected that I would act like I was better than other people. And I think to this day people are surprised that I don't act like that, because they think I'm good at stuff and that should entitle me to be like rude to people or something. It's really bizarre to me. And I told him that as a kid, I just didn't understand how you won at life, like what was winning. And if there's not like a clear competition with what victory looks like, then you can't be better. And if winning is making other people better, then you or helping other people become good, then you can't win by saying you're better than other people. So like if I'm playing a sport and that sport has, all right, you win this by scoring more points. Okay, if I consistently score more points at this thing than somebody else, I'm better than them at that. Cool, great. But that doesn't mean that I'm better than them at life, because there's no clear, it's not a trivial game. And I think lots of people reduce life to a trivial game, and then that empowers them to feel that they're better at something, even though they don't have any clarity about what success is. And lots of times when they say what success is, it's the accumulation of money. And it's like, you think life is just acquiring money? And if you really think that, you clearly have lost.
Well, one of the wonderful gifts, as I see it, and it connects to some of the things we say about language, is that I was fortunate to have just been brought home into a community of loving people who really just enjoyed each other's company. So even though my brothers and I were considered fairly smart, or there are lots of things we did very early in age, what we notice is the purpose of time together was the joy of each other's company. We often talk so much about description, we forget the importance of affect. For instance, even if one thinks about sports, human beings everywhere, we engage in music. And music is not a competition. Music is a celebration and language that we just enjoy. And this question of, there are a lot of times, for instance, when I speak with some philosophers, and we talk about language, there is a lot of value and truth being said when somebody answers, when you say, what are you thinking? Or what are you talking about? And somebody says, nothing.
Yes.
There are these moments of nothing that are just so great.
I do that all the time, actually.
All the time. Or when you go for a walk, even though you may have a conversation along the way, it really isn't that you're trying to aim to get to a point. It's the joy of the walk and the joy of conversing. And that aspect of living, you know what I mean? That is often missed
Oh my gosh.
in these imposed scarcity on us.
In the industrialized capitalistic world we live in, when I got more and more committed to being a philosopher and focusing on thinking and articulating these ideas that people said might have some value, I noticed that my daily routine just didn't align with how they had instructed people to live, with like a 9-to-5 routine. And even if I tried to do that, I needed to like leave the office and go on a random walk that accomplished nothing. And I would come back and be really productive. And I remember I was the editor-in-chief of this small publication, and my boss would get mad at me because she just didn't think I was doing that much work. She just I didn't look that busy. She'd always see me walking or leaving the office and coming back, or just doing stuff that seemed trivial and not like that linear industrial work. And this boss got upset. And then our review came in, and I was bracing myself for just a very negative review. And they looked at everything and they said, we can't see anything we've done over the last 6 months or so that don't have your fingerprints firmly on it. And it'd be hard to chart our growth without acknowledging that you have been responsible for the vast majority of it. And you could see that it just didn't comprehend. It just didn't reconcile in their brain how this person that they perceived did nothing actually did all this stuff. And it's just, it's fascinating. But to go with the lowercase b and the capital B, I kind of want to jump in about a part of my book about the word fricano and see what you think of this linguistic progression where, as Black people, going from the lowercase b that's diminutive to the capital B, but then trying to cultivate a word or identity that's more indicative of our lived experience and not just the continual progress from a diminutive title. And not saying, clearly it's progression, but this is something that, and I'm asking you because I don't want to be a Black person that tells Black people what to call themselves. I want it to be a discourse and to get some feedback and some thoughts so that we can hopefully create something that's empowering linguistically and psychologically for people of color. And so you're a real smart guy, and I'd love to get some thoughts.
Well, fairly. The first thing is to bear in mind that some people forget that when we're talking about these issues, we are talking about human beings, but human beings not as things. Human beings as relationships and activities. So I usually put it this way. The big mistake we make is if you could imagine, right, two parentheses, open and closed. And the idea is this is what a thing is. It's closed. However, human reality is really this, open. And so that means when you go from a lower to another one, it's not the end of a story. It's just part of a story that's greater than ourselves. There could be a time when people just stop calling themselves a lot of the names we use today. And even the names we use, they can develop different meanings. You could pick any positive word and turn it into a slur. This is right. This is what the right wing is doing right now with anything. There are people who could even make the study of mathematics into a slur. Okay? Could you believe they're teaching our children mathematics? And so the thing is, this is part of our ambiguous creative potential. So when I say from lowercase b to uppercase b, what I'm trying to say is that uppercase b is dialectically open. And it doesn't have to be permanent. And that's why I also make a move to the political acknowledgement that when we're committing political action, it always eventually reaches those in relation to whom we and they are anonymous. The anonymous, those to come, those far away who are affected by our actions, ultimately are affected in a way that's good. If in relation to us, they look back and they're like, damn, this is pretty good. Thank you for doing this. You see?
Philosophers, in many ways, we speak to the anonymous if we're any good.
We always ultimately. And that is what part of what's radical, because that transcends narcissistic love. Narcissistic love says you can only love those who are like you. Now, if you could only love those who are like you, then you have to eradicate all the ways in which they're not like you. Which it means eventually you only love yourself. But the moment in which you can identify yourself, this is a little philosophical conundrum, It means you have to be posited to yourself as an object of consciousness, which means you're other than yourself, which means you got to go out back like old Yella and get rid of yourself. So it unravels. However, radical love means that we have to acknowledge that no human relation is ever complete. And that means that we have to bear in mind, it's not only about our relationship to other human beings, but to other dimensions of reality. We have a capacity to love beyond ourselves. And this is something that is extraordinary. And what it can do, especially in the production of meaning, wow. I mean, it's funny when I speak with many folks who are still locked in 19th and 20th century models of thinking. I'm like, yo, there's so many things that we can think about in the world today. And part of it is we live in a very different world. We live in a world that is smaller. It's smaller because we can traverse space in a short amount of time, shorter than our ancestors have. And when you can cross space quickly, space shrinks. So we live in a smaller planet. And we have different demands. We have different struggles. And what we need to do is to get out of our box and understand what it is actually to face possibility. So even though I say from lowercase b to uppercase b, the uppercase b is actually a metaphor. It's a metaphor about possibility. And we could begin to name, right now, we are living in a world of constantly changing human beings, not only trans beings, but even beyond those categories, the complexity, even how we think time. I usually put it this way. I'll just do a little tap for you, right? Humanity could go like this, right?
Yep.
That doesn't sound white, but even among people who are historically Europe, they could do.
Yep.
But some dudes came along and began to say, cut it out. You got to go through the word like, or at a best a waltz. But sometimes I demonstrate to audiences, we could think way beyond those confines of 4 and 3. You could make 4 and 3 into 7. 4. Or you could even think 11. And the moment I just did those 2 bars, you begin to think, why are we stopping there? We could do music in 17. We could do music in 69. We could do music in 103. There's so many ways to do things, and we're sitting confined in this little small set of terms as if that's reality. To bring it back home, reality is greater than being. Being, and this is hard for many people to understand, being is just a subset of reality. Reality is way beyond even imagination. And this is where it's so interesting, because imagination already transcends a lot of what is. So we need to tap into our potential. That's what we got to do.
So I got one last question, and what you just said is like an elongated version of what I say a lot, and that I tell people to not be limited by your own imagination. Like, the amount of times if you pay attention to the world, you will encounter things all the time that you didn't imagine. And you'll think of that as trivial, but really it's profound because your brain didn't think that that was possible. And then it just happened. And now it becomes natural. And so you have to be open to not being limited by your imagination to have a capacity to really experience the world in which you live. And this goes to the last question, because we could talk for hours, but we have to wrap it up at some point.
Mm-hmm.
You came down with COVID, and you write quite eloquently about how the impact of that at the beginning of your book. And I think this connects back to the theme of existence preceding essence and the importance of breath and recognizing that you're not just a body. And COVID really gives us this really profound philosophical things to look at, to value existence, to be aware of reality that's beyond us, because there's stuff happening on the other side of the planet that we couldn't even imagine, and now it's consuming the whole planet and changing how we do stuff from day to day. And we have to create a language and practices to respond to something we can't see, that can take our breath away, that we couldn't imagine, and we have to live in that world. And, fortunately for me, knock on wood, I have not gotten COVID at all throughout the entire pandemic. And I have a kid right now, so I'm definitely being quite vigilant to make sure I don't get COVID. But you went through this.
In my case,
you went through it.
I got hit at the beginning. I got hit at the beginning in March 2020. And of course, that's a different period of having COVID, because it still there's still a lot to learn about it. But at the time, we didn't know anything. So it was like the zombie apocalypse. You know what I mean? And and people are dying all over the place. And especially with me being a person who spends up to that point, most of a typical year for me was going around the planet several times. Family for me is a large extended human community. So it meant that I was experiencing also or learning about the death of others exponentially. So, and then in my case, I almost died. I mean, it was wild that the physician said, my medical record did match what they were seeing in front of them. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, the charts look like a cadaver, like a dead person, but you're alive, so we got to work with it. So, and so the thing is, and the more we learned. So this was a narrow escape, but the thing is, it's interesting how you live when you have a relationship to death in which you think about things that are always more important. And so for me, even though I was struggling to live, I was also living for me was not simply a biological phenomenon. Even though every part of me, my brains to my toes, were in shreds. And where I could barely see, images for me were quadrupled. My hands could barely move. Uh, Something I'd said to my wife when we first met that scared the crap out of her, she totally understood. And what that was I said to her, I got to tell you something about me. I'm a musician, but I'm also a writer. And for me, writing is living. If I cease to write, I die. So think about it. In the midst of all that, I found a way to struggle and just feel words on a keyboard because I could play piano and drums. And so I could actually construct things from memory in how they feel. That book, Fear of Black Consciousness, was written literally through breath and touch because I could not see the words. And it had to be read back to me. And
that's incredible.
And that tells you a lot, right? That meant I was not just breathing, I was also living through writing. So, and with the belief that I was dying. And at the same time, it was clear to me, because it was not just that book. I wrote 2 books. I wrote Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization and Fear of Black Consciousness. But it wasn't because, I don't need to prove anything as a professor or anything like that. It was just that in all of us, there is this need to breathe, to speak, to communicate, to share. And so, in a way, I'm saying all this about love, but that was also an act of radical love.
I genuinely couldn't think of a better note to end up this podcast conversation on. The connectivity of breath, creating a meaning to fight for existence, your own existence, but also your existence for other people, because you're producing work that you hope will benefit the unknown, the people that you will potentially never ever encounter, and there's a meaning for that. And to do that within the space of something that's, ransacking and the world is quite profound. And I think it really articulates the importance of valuing existence before essence. And that gives you the strength to cultivate a meaningful life. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so, Lewis, I can't thank you enough for being a guest on the podcast. And I look forward to, many meaningful conversations and, the expression of breath as we cultivate meaning.
Thank you, Barrett. And thank you for your work as well, which I must tell you, I've had the joy, not simply of reading and writing about, but of teaching. And that's the whole point. We're part of something greater than ourselves.
I hope your students enjoyed my book this semester.
Oh, they did.
Love it.
Oh, they did.
Love it. Awesome.
Okay.
Have a great day. Talk to you soon.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.